In the medieval world, the sky was not just a canvas for stars, it was a map of meanings, a calendar of fate, and a force that pulled on the human soul. And among all celestial bodies, the moon held the most terrifying power. It was not merely a source of beauty or light, it was a trigger for madness. People in the Middle Ages genuinely believed that the full moon could affect a person's mind, not symbolically, but physiologically. They thought that the moon's gravitational pull didn't just sway the tides, but also the fluids of the brain. It was believed that humans, like the oceans, were governed by invisible forces, and that the lunar cycle could disturb the balance of humors within the body, especially the brain. When that balance tipped, the mind would slip into chaos. This belief wasn't some rural folktale whispered in peasant villages. It was taken seriously by doctors, theologians, and legal courts. The term lunatic, still used for centuries, comes from the Latin word luna, meaning moon. Physicians wrote in their medical texts that people prone to seizures or episodes of madness were more likely to suffer during a full moon. Some even recommended isolation or special precautions during certain moon phases for those with melancholic temperaments. Crimes committed during full moons were sometimes viewed differently, not entirely excused, but partially understood. In some early court records, defendants were claimed to have acted under the moon's influence, and while not always spared, such a claim could sway judgment. Families were warned not to let vulnerable relatives wander at night during a full moon, for fear they might not return or return changed. The fear extended beyond individuals. Entire towns altered behavior based on the moon. Farmers hesitated to plant certain crops under a full moon, believing it could spoil growth. Children were kept indoors. And night watchmen, especially in larger medieval towns, reported more disturbances and unrest during the brightest nights, reinforcing the belief that the moon stirred something dark in the soul. Of course, today we understand mental health and sleep cycles in more scientific terms. While modern studies have debated whether lunar phases affect behavior, the consensus is that the full moon's power is psychological, not gravitational. But in the medieval world, a place without artificial light, surrounded by superstition, religion, and fear, the full moon was not just a phase, it was a warning, a symbol in the sky that said, "Tonight, something in you may come undone." In the flickering candlelight of a medieval cottage, a young woman cracks a raw egg into a bowl of cold water. She leans in, eyes wide, watching the egg white swirl and stretch into cloudy shapes. Her heart pounds because what she sees might not just be breakfast, it might be a prophecy. In the Middle Ages, eggs weren't only food. They were tools of divination, believed to carry messages from the invisible world, signs from God, omens from fate, or whispers from the spirit realm. The practice was called umancy, from the Greek un, meaning egg, and it was surprisingly widespread across Europe. From peasant girls to pious housewives, many turned to the humble egg as a way to see beyond the veil. The method was deceptively simple. Crack a raw egg into a bowl of water and read the shapes that form in the whites, much like how we read tea leaves or ink blots today. But the interpretations were anything but random. If the shape looked like a coffin, a death in the family, a ship, a journey or danger at sea, a ring, marriage soon, a snake, betrayal, people believed these patterns weren't accidental but divinely orchestrated symbols. Young women were especially drawn to egg divination. In some regions, on the eve of midsummer or Halloween, girls would place an egg white in water and leave it by the window overnight. In the morning, the shapes were read to reveal the initial of a future husband, or a glimpse of how he would die. Yes, even that grim detail was part of the superstition. Some even whispered prayers over the bowl or recited Latin phrases to make the vision clearer, mixing Christian ritual with folk magic in the way only the Middle Ages could. But it didn't end with matchmaking. In many homes, eggs were placed beside sickbeds to monitor a patient's fate. If the egg turned black or cloudy overnight, it was taken as a sure sign of death. Some healers claimed they could draw out illness into the egg itself, essentially using the egg as a spiritual sponge. A rotting egg meant the illness had been absorbed, but not always in time. The church, unsurprisingly, frowned upon such practices. Umancy was condemned as superstition or, worse, witchcraft. Some women were punished for invoking the devil through egg magic, but the practice persisted quietly, tucked into kitchens and whispered behind closed doors, especially in rural areas where formal medicine was absent or distrusted. To us, the idea of reading an egg might sound quaint, even silly. But in a time without science as we know it, no microscopes, no germ theory, no weather forecasts, symbolic knowledge filled the gap. People longed for meaning, for reassurance, for signs in the chaos of sickness and uncertainty. And so they looked to what they had, and what they had was an egg, round, silent, and full of mystery. A tiny, fragile oracle waiting to speak. In a medieval clinic, whether it was a dusty back room in a monastery or the chambers of a learned physician, there was one item more essential than any leech, salve, or scripture. A flask of urine, not hidden, not discarded, displayed proudly, studied closely. Golden, cloudy, dark, or bloody, urine was the mirror of the soul. For physicians of the Middle Ages, the art of diagnosis began and sometimes ended with a patient's pee. This practice, known as uroscopy, was considered cutting-edge science at the time, based on the ancient Greek and Roman belief that the four bodily humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, governed human health. And because urine was believed to carry traces of those humors, it became the most accessible, observable substance to read the body's inner balance. Doctors carried urine color charts, intricately illustrated with circular flasks of yellow, orange, red, green, even blue, each shade linked to specific ailments. Was the urine pale and watery, perhaps a cold imbalance in the body, thick and reddish, likely inflammation or hot blood, sweet-smelling or sticky, a dangerous sign of what we now know to be diabetes, though in medieval times it was seen as a rare and mysterious wasting disease. And yes, some physicians tasted the urine. It sounds unthinkable now, but in an era before microscopes or blood tests, taste was another data point. A sweet flavor meant sugar, which signaled an imbalance of humors. Bitter notes suggested bile, sharpness, and excessive melancholy. It wasn't about disgust, it was about diagnosis. To the medieval physician, the mouth was a tool, like the eye or the hand, but uroscopy wasn't only a physician's task. Wealthier families, when seeking a diagnosis, would send a messenger carrying a sealed vial of urine to a faraway doctor. The patient didn't need to be present. The physician would examine the liquid alone, hold it to the light, smell it, swirl it gently, and deliver a detailed report on the patient's condition, personality, and prognosis, all without ever meeting them. Urine also had spiritual significance. Many believed that its clarity or foulness could reflect the state of the soul. A clean, light stream was linked to spiritual purity. Dark, cloudy urine, a sign of sin, corruption, or divine punishment. Monks who dabbled in medicine sometimes consulted both scripture and urine before recommending penance or prayer, and in some darker corners of belief, urine was used in magic. Folk healers might use it to cast protective spells or to identify a hidden enemy. There were even rituals where enemies were cursed by boiling their urine with herbs, binding their fate to the bubbling contents of a pot. To modern eyes, it's easy to laugh, but pause. Imagine a world where no x-rays exist, no lab tests, no stethoscopes. What you eat, how you feel, how you sleep, it all must be interpreted through what your body gives you. In that world, urine was not waste, it was a message from within. It was your body speaking its truth, and if you knew how to read it, it might just save your life. Step into the streets of a medieval town and take a breath if you dare. Rotten meat, unwashed bodies, waste dumped into alleys, and the stench of sickness all hung heavy in the air. But for the people of the Middle Ages, that foul odor wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly. Because in their world, smell was disease. This belief was rooted in the powerful theory of miasma, the idea that bad air, particularly bad-smelling air, was the cause of illness. It wasn't germs that killed you, it was the air that reeked of rot, decay, or impurity. The more foul the odor, the more dangerous the air. And during outbreaks like the Black Death, this theory was not just common sense, it was law. The word miasma comes from the Greek for pollution, and in the medieval imagination, polluted air was thick with invisible toxins. These toxins came from marshes, from garbage, from open wounds, from sin. And they could enter the body through the nose or skin, poisoning the blood and disrupting the body's sacred balance of humors. Disease, they believed, was not something passed from person to person, but something absorbed from the corrupted air around them. This belief led to one of the most haunting images of the era, the plague doctor's mask. With its long, curved beak and glassy eye holes, the mask looked like something out of a nightmare. But it wasn't just a macabre costume, it was a survival tool, designed with miasma in mind. Doctors stuffed the beak with fragrant herbs, dried flowers, or spiced vinegar-soaked cloth to filter out the bad air. They believed that by surrounding themselves with pleasant smells, they could ward off infection. Many also wore long waxed coats and gloves to create a physical barrier between their bodies and the death-tainted world. For ordinary citizens, too, smell became a battleground. People carried pomanders, small containers filled with aromatic herbs like lavender, rosemary, or clove, tied around their waists or worn as jewelry. Some held nosegays, tight bundles of fragrant plants, in front of their faces when walking through town. During mass burials, those who could afford it covered their mouths with perfumed handkerchiefs, hoping scent alone would protect their lives. And then there were the elaborate fumigation rituals. Rooms were cleansed by burning bundles of juniper, pine resin, or sulfur. In some cities, fires were lit in the streets not for warmth, but to purify the air. Bells were rung to disrupt the miasma, and incense filled churches not just as worship but as public health strategy. But the fear of bad smells wasn't only medical, it was moral. Filth was tied to sin, rot to punishment. The stench of decay was not just earthly corruption, it was a sign that God had turned his face away. And so, personal hygiene took on spiritual weight. Washing was not just about cleanliness, it was about salvation. Wealthier people bathed in scented waters. Others rubbed themselves with vinegar or citrus peels to drive off both illness and suspicion. Because if you smelled bad, people believed, you might already be marked by death, or worse, spreading it. Today we know that disease travels through bacteria, viruses, droplets, things invisible and odorless. But we also know this: the human nose is deeply tied to memory, fear, and instinct. And in a world without microscopes or penicillin, smell was the only alarm they had. So when a medieval person recoiled from a corpse or covered their face in the market, they weren't just being cautious. They believed in their deepest bones that to breathe in that foulness was to let death inside. And in a world where so many did die, can you really blame them? In a world where hospitals were rare, doctors expensive, and medicine mysterious at best, where plagues swept through villages and faith often stood in place of science, there existed a belief both majestic and desperate. That the king's touch could heal you, this was not metaphor, it was doctrine. Across centuries in medieval France and England, the power to heal was considered part of a king's divine right. And the disease most commonly associated with this royal miracle was scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that caused painful, unsightly swellings in the neck. It was known simply as the king's evil. Scrofula was not only disfiguring, it was humiliating. It marked people with a visible reminder of their suffering, and for many, it was a life sentence. But there was hope. Not in medicine, not in prayer alone, but in the living body of the monarch. It was believed that through their anointed bloodline, kings carried a holy power, one passed down from God himself. The ritual was theatrical and deeply symbolic. Subjects afflicted with scrofula would line up by the hundreds, waiting to be touched by the king's hand. The monarch, seated on a raised platform, would press his fingers gently against the swollen lymph nodes of the sick, often while murmuring a sacred phrase. Le roi te touche Dieu te guérisse. The king touches you, may God heal you. The king would then give the patient a touch piece, usually a small gold or silver coin, which the sufferer wore around the neck as a token of healing. These ceremonies were public, solemn, and meticulously recorded. Chroniclers described them in reverent detail. Some claimed the sick stood up immediately, cured. Others said the swellings disappeared overnight. Whether or not these stories were true mattered less than the fact that people believed them. For the monarchy, this belief was more than divine superstition, it was political gold. The ability to heal became proof of legitimacy. A king who could cure was not just ruling by blood, but by divine selection. And so, the ritual became a pillar of propaganda, reinforcing the king's sacred role at a time when rebellions, plagues, and doubt threatened the throne. Even kings who were skeptical themselves kept the tradition alive. Henry IV of France reportedly doubted the practice, but still performed it, because to refuse was to risk undermining royal authority in the eyes of the people. Queen Elizabeth I, despite her Protestant reformations, continued the ritual. So did monarchs long after the Enlightenment began unraveling the old beliefs. And here's the strangest part: some people really did get better. Perhaps it was the placebo effect. Perhaps the touch pieces were symbols of hope, helping the body rally against despair. Or perhaps the healing was spiritual, a kind of release that no physician's scalpel could provide. Whatever the reason, the royal touch survived for centuries, until the rise of modern medicine, when science finally began to answer the prayers once offered at the king's feet. But even then, for many, it was hard to let go. The last recorded royal healing ceremony in England took place in 1712, performed by Queen Anne. After that, the monarchy ceased to be divine. The touch no longer healed. But in that long stretch of history, through famine, war, and disease, millions placed their faith and their bodies in the hands of a king, not because they believed in magic, but because they believed in something bigger than their pain. And sometimes belief is the strongest medicine of all. You're a child in a medieval village. You reach out with your left hand to grab a piece of bread, and your grandmother gasps. Your teacher slaps your wrist. At church, the priest frowns. Not because you're rude, but because you use the devil's hand. In the Middle Ages, being left-handed wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. To be born left-handed was to live with suspicion etched into your very bones. You weren't simply different, You were marked, possibly cursed, and in some cases, whispered about behind closed doors as someone who might be in league with dark forces. This deep-rooted superstition goes back even further than the medieval period, but it found its cruelest expression during this era of religious fear, rigid order, and overwhelming superstition. The word sinister itself comes from the Latin sinistra, which originally meant left, but over time evolved to mean evil, unlucky, even unclean. The word dexter, from which we get dexterity, meant right, both in direction and in virtue. In a world that prized order and symmetry, the right hand was associated with all things good, God's blessing, knightly oaths, and holy sacraments. Paintings of angels, saints, and the risen Christ almost always show them gesturing or blessing with the right hand. To do something with the right hand wasn't just a phrase, it was a moral imperative. The left hand, by contrast, was linked to chaos, deception, and impurity. In religious rituals, gestures made with the left hand were considered mockery. In legal proceedings, if a person gestured or swore an oath with the left hand, some believed it nullified the promise or worse, invited damnation. Left-handedness wasn't treated as a trait, it was treated as a flaw of the soul. Children born left-handed were routinely forced to correct their handedness. In monasteries and early schools, it was common to see children's left hands tied behind their backs during lessons. Teachers would strike children who wrote with the left, demanding they use their good hand. Some were punished publicly, shamed in front of others, or told that their hand was under the influence of Satan. Left-handedness even seeped into the criminal codes and social folklore of the time. A woman accused of witchcraft who happened to be left-handed was considered twice as suspicious. Trials noted her unnatural tendencies. Even among midwives and healers, women already under scrutiny, using the left hand during childbirth was sometimes seen as an ill omen. But this fear wasn't just symbolic, it had real consequences. People lost trust. Children internalized shame. Some developed physical or psychological trauma from being forced to abandon their natural orientation. Left-handedness became a secret to hide, a flaw to fix, a sin to scrub away, even though it was something no one chose. Why such fear? Because the medieval world was obsessed with hierarchy and alignment. Heaven above, earth below, God on the right, sin on the left. To blur that boundary was to threaten the entire worldview. And nothing blurred it more than the left-handed child who refused to conform. It wasn't until centuries later that science would understand handedness as a neutral neurological trait, not a spiritual deviation. But for the medieval mind, the hand you used revealed something deep about your soul, and if you used the wrong hand, you might, in their eyes, be walking the path to hell. In today's world, when the rain doesn't come or a storm rolls in, we turn to forecasts, satellites, and climate models. But in the Middle Ages, the sky was not just a reflection of nature, it was a window into God's judgment. And one of the most persistent, deeply rooted beliefs of that era was this: immoral sex, especially outside marriage, could provoke divine punishment in the form of weather. Yes, they truly believed sex could control the skies. This wasn't just the opinion of a few strict priests. It was a widespread cultural belief, woven into the sermons of churches, the chronicles of kings, and the anxious whispers of entire communities. The logic was terrifyingly simple. When humans sinned with the body, God responded with storms, droughts, or natural disasters. In particular, fornication, sex outside of wedlock, was seen as a direct offense to divine order. Young couples caught in secret acts of desire might be blamed for a failed harvest or an unexpected hailstorm. If the wheat withered in the fields, villagers asked, "Who has brought shame upon us?" And the answer they looked for wasn't in the soil, but in the bedrooms. This belief wasn't limited to rumor. Clergy preached it from pulpits. In rural towns, some priests would even call for public penance after strange weather events, urging people to confess hidden sins to lift God's anger. Sexual activity during holy days, in particular, was considered a grievous offense. It was said to darken the heavens. Some sermons claimed that even married couples, if too lustful, could summon God's thunder as rebuke. Storms were not just storms, they were God's voice, loud and booming, condemning sin. Droughts were not just unfortunate weather patterns, they were signs that the land had been defiled by moral rot. In times of crisis, especially during famine, plague, or war, this belief took on even darker forms. Communities, desperate for answers, would search for scapegoats. A woman known to be sexually loose, or a couple caught in an affair, could be blamed for the storm that flooded the crops or the lightning that burned a barn. Some were publicly punished, others were exiled, a few were even killed. There are records of communities gathering in churches during weather disasters, begging for mercy. They prayed not just for rain or sunlight, but for forgiveness, forgiveness for the sins of the flesh that they believed had disturbed heaven's balance. In this way, weather became morality's mirror, and sex, the most intimate of human acts, became a communal risk. Your private passion could bring public ruin. Looking back now, it may seem absurd. But we must understand what drove this belief. The medieval world was fragile, crops failed often, plagues arrived without warning, life was hard, short, and unpredictable. Without science to explain cause and effect, people turned to divine causality, and the human body, full of desire and contradiction, became the most suspicious source of all. So they watched the clouds, listened to thunder, and wondered, whose sin did this? Because in the world of the Middle Ages, sometimes all it took to change the weather was a single kiss in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Seen by the wrong god, we often look back at the Middle Ages and laugh. Eggs that tell the future, urine as a medical chart, sex that summons lightning. It feels like fiction, a time of witches and weirdness where logic had no home. But here's the truth, they weren't foolish, they were afraid. Afraid of illness with no cure, of storms with no warning, of death that came quietly without explanation. In a world without science, belief became survival, and those beliefs, as strange as they seem to us now, help people make sense of chaos. They gave structure to suffering, meaning to madness, and above all, they gave comfort, because it's easier to believe a sickness came from bad air or a stillbirth from the full moon than to accept that life might just be random and cruel. So before we judge their superstitions too harshly, ask yourself, what do we still cling to today? What modern myths guide us about luck, love, health, or control, even when we know better? Maybe we're not so different. Maybe even now we're still medieval, just with better lighting.